My mom expected me to have my dead stepdad's baby. When I turned 18, my mom cornered me in the kitchen and let me know that she'd saved my stepfather's sperm before he died so I could carry his baby, and finally let her meet his biological child. My stepdad, Robert, died in a car accident when I was 8. He and mom had tried for years to have a baby, but never could. Robert had been good to me for the 3 years I knew him. He taught me to ride a bike and came to school plays, but mom never recovered from losing him. She kept all his clothes in the closet and still set his place at dinner 10 years later. I've been waiting for this for years, she said, pulling out a folder full of medical documents. Before Robert died, we'd been seeing a fertility specialist. I had them preserve several samples just in case we needed IVF. She smiled at me, like she was giving me a gift. Now you can help me have Robert's baby. The baby we were meant to have. I stared at her, unable to process what she was saying. She wanted me to carry my dead stepfather's child. Mom, that's insane, I said. I'm not having Robert's baby. She acted like she hadn't heard me. She'd already made appointments at a fertility clinic. She showed me calendars tracking my cycle that she'd been keeping for years. She'd been planning this since I got my first period at 13. You're young and healthy, she explained while showing me success rate statistics. My eggs are still viable, but my uterus can't carry anymore. You'll be the surrogate. But the baby will be mine and Robert's. You're just lending us your womb. She had legal documents drawn up about custody and parental rights. She'd thought of everything except asking if I was willing to do this. When I refused, she acted betrayed. Robert loved you like his own daughter, she said. This is how you can honor his memory and give me the family he wanted us to have. She pulled out photos of Robert holding baby. Look how happy he was. He deserved biological children of his own. When I said no, the manipulation escalated. Daily, she'd leave baby clothes on my bed with notes about how lonely she was. She'd cry at dinner about how I was destroying her last chance at happiness. She called me selfish and unempathetic for not helping after what she'd sacrificed as a single mother. I gave up my life for you, she'd say. The least you can do is give me 9 months. She started involving other people in her campaign. She told her grief support group that I was refusing to help her fulfill Robert's dying wish, even though Robert never even knew about this plan. The other widows called me heartless. She told our extended family I was being cruel by denying her closure. My aunt said carrying the baby would be a beautiful way to heal our family's loss. Even my grandma said I should consider it since mom couldn't have more children naturally. Then mom started getting desperate. She made an appointment at Desco, the fertility clinic, and told them I'd agreed to be her surrogate. When we got there, and I told the doctor I had not agreed to this. The doctor looked horrified. This has to be completely voluntary, she told my mother. We can't force your daughter to carry a pregnancy. Mom broke down, sobbing in the office saying I was killing her last connection to Robert. That night, mom sat me down with a new proposition. If you won't carry the baby, then at least donate your eggs, she said. I'll find another surrogate, but the baby needs to be connected to our family. When I said no to that, too, she suggested we could extract and freeze my eggs now, and I could decide later when I was more mature. Every compromise was just another version of her insane plan. I found searches on her computer for fertility laws and parental rights over adult children's medical decisions. She'd been on forums asking if she could legally require me to provide genetic material for family preservation. She'd even contacted lawyers about whether preserved sperm constituted an inheritance that Robert had left to both of us. She was looking for any legal way to force me to have this baby. One night, I woke up to find her standing over my bed with a syringe. It's just hormones to regulate your cycle, she said when I screamed. To make sure everything's ready when you change your mind. I pushed her away and locked myself in the bathroom while she pounded on the door, crying that Robert's baby was dying with every day I waited since my eggs were getting older. I grabbed my Phone from where I dropped it on the finishing bathroom floor and sat with my back against the door. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Mom was still out there crying and talking through the door about how she was trying to help me, how the hormones would just make everything easier when I came around to her plan. I pulled my knees up to my chest and tried to think. I couldn't stay in this house anymore. Not after waking up to find her standing over me with a syringe. I didn't even know what was actually in it. She said hormones. But what if it was something else? Something to make me sick or weak or compliant. I opened my Janing text and found Tristan's name. My fingers fumbled on the screen as I typed out what happened. Trying to explain. Finding Mom in my room with a needle, locking myself in the bathroom. Not knowing what to do. His response came back in seconds, telling me to get out of there and come to his place right now. I told him I would as soon as Mom went back to her room. I sat there, listening to her cry and plead outside the door for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes. Finally, I heard her footsteps going down the hall and her bedroom door closing. I waited another 10 minutes to make sure she wasn't coming back. Then I unlocked the bathroom door as quietly as I could and crept into my bedroom. I grabbed my school backpack and started shoving things into it: phone charger, laptop, a change of clothes, toothbrush, the syringe I'd knocked out of her hand that had rolled under my bed. I didn't know if I'd need it as evidence, but I wrapped it in a sock and put it in a zippered pocket. My hands were still shaking so bad I could barely zip the bag. I kept looking at my door, expecting Mom to appear. The house was quiet, except for the sound of my own breathing. I checked my phone and saw it was almost 5:00 the morning. I'd been locked in that bathroom for hours. I pulled on my shoes and a jacket and slung the backpack over my shoulder. Then I walked as quietly as possible down the stairs, avoiding the creaky third step from the bottom. The front door seemed impossibly loud when I turned the lock, but Mom's bedroom door stayed closed. I stepped outside into the gray pre-dawn light and started walking fast toward the bus stop 6 blocks away. I didn't look back at the house. The bus ride to Tristan's apartment took 40 minutes, and I spent the whole time jumping at every sound. When I finally got to his building and knocked on his door, he opened it immediately like he'd been waiting. He took one look at my face and pulled me inside. His apartment was small and messy with clothes on the floor and dishes in the sink, but it felt safer than anywhere I'd been in weeks. I dropped my backpack and everything I've been holding and just broke. I started crying and couldn't stop. Tristan got me to sit on his couch and brought me water and waited until I could talk. Then I told him everything from the beginning. The conversation in the kitchen when I turned 18, and Mom pulled out the folder about Robert's preserved sperm. The cycle tracking calendar she'd been keeping since I was 13, the legal documents about custody and parental rights, the fertility clinic appointment, where she'd lied and said I'd agreed to be a surrogate, the baby clothes left on my bed with notes, the family members calling me selfish, the computer searches about forcing adult children to donate genetic material, and finally, waking up tonight to find her standing over my bed with that syringe. Tristan's face went from shock to horrified as I talked. When I finished, he said I could stay on his couch as long as I needed, while I figured out what to do next. He said what Mom was doing wasn't normal grief, and I wasn't wrong to be scared. I spent the rest of that morning on Tristan's laptop researching my legal rights as an 18-year-old adult. I found articles about reproductive coercion and harassment and family law. What Mom had been doing seemed to qualify as coercion. At minimum, the syringe incident scared me most because I still didn't know what was actually in it. She said hormones to regulate my cycle. But what if I'd been planning to sedate me or do something worse? I found information about protective orders and police reports. The idea of reporting my own mother to the cops made me feel sick, but I kept thinking about her standing over my bed in the dark with that needle. I screenshotted everything I found and saved the links. Tristan helped me search for therapists who worked with family trauma and boundary issues. We found someone named Naomi Giles who specialized in exactly that kind of thing. Her website said she had experience with reproductive coercion and in shed family systems. I called her office and got lucky because she'd just had a cancellation for a phone consultation that afternoon. When I talked to her for those first 20 minutes, I felt like someone finally understood that what was happening to me was serious and wrong. She didn't tell me I was overreacting or that mom was just grieving. She asked careful questions about the cycle tracking and to the syringe, and said those were major red flags. Just having someone validate that I wasn't crazy made me want to cry again. She had an opening for a full session in 2 days and I took it immediately. Naomi told me during that first call that I should start documenting everything systematically. She said if things escalated further, I might need evidence for legal protection. So, I spent the next few hours going through my phone and taking screenshots of every text message mom had sent me about the baby plan. There were dozens of them talking about Robert's legacy and my duty to the family and how beautiful it would be to carry his child. I wrote down dates and details of every conversation I could remember. The first time she brought it up in the kitchen, the fertility clinic appointment, the night she tried to get to me to agree to egg donation instead, finding the computer searches about parental rights over adult children's reproductive material. I took photos of the baby clothes she'd left on my bed that I'd shoved in my closet. I wrote down the names of family members who'd pressured me and what they'd said. The whole process made me feel sick. But Naomi was right that I needed a record of all this. The next day, when I knew mom would be at work, I went back to the raid house to get more of my things. My key still worked and the house was empty and quiet. I felt like I was trespassing, even though I'd lived there my whole life. I went straight to my room and packed another bag with more clothes and my important documents like my birth certificate and social security card. Then I went to mom's computer in the home office. She hadn't deleted her browser history, and what I found made my stomach turn. Searches for whether parents have legal rights over adult children's eggs. Forum posts asking if she could require me to provide genetic material for family preservation. Consultations with lawyers about whether Robert's preserved sperm counted as an inheritance that belonged to both of us. She'd been looking for any possible legal loophole to force me into this. I took photos of the search history with my phone and then cleared it so I wouldn't know I'd seen. I grabbed my bags and left before she could come home and find me there. My first real therapy session with Naomi happened in her office 2 days after I'd left home. She had a calm way of talking that made me feel less panicked. She explained that what I was experiencing had actual names and definitions. Inchment was when family boundaries got so blurred that people couldn't tell where one person ended and another began. Reproductive coercion was using pressure or force to control someone's reproductive choices. She said mom's grief over Robert had twisted into something really unhealthy, where she couldn't see me as a separate person with my own body and rights. She kept talking about me as a tool to get what she wanted instead of as my own human being. Naomi said protecting myself from that wasn't betrayal or abandonment. It was necessary survival. She said I had the right to bodily autonomy no matter how much mom was hurting, or what she thought Robert would have wanted. Hearing a professional say all that out loud made something loosen in my chest. We spent the rest of that session creating what Naomi called a safety plan. First was staying away from the house completely so mom couldn't access me physically. Second was limiting all contact to text messages, only so I'd have a record and wouldn't get trapped in manipulative conversations. Third was establishing clear boundaries about topics that were completely off limits, including anything related to pregnancy, surrogacy, egg donation, or Robert's preserved sperm. Naomi helped me write out exactly what those boundaries were, so I could communicate them clearly. The plan felt both empowering and terrifying, because I knew enforcing it would make mom even more angry. But Naomi reminded me that mom's anger at my boundaries was not my responsibility to manage. My only responsibility was keeping myself safe. That night, I sat at Tristan's kitchen table and wrote out a formal letter to Mom. I stated clearly that I would not discuss anything related to pregnancy, surrogacy, egg donation, or Robert's preserved sperm ever again. I said all future contact had to be by text message only, and I would not respond to calls or in-person visits. I said if she violated these boundaries, I would have to consider legal options for my protection. Writing it all out made my stomach hurt and my hands shake. I kept thinking about how hurt and angry she would be when she read it. But I also kept thinking about waking up to find her standing over my bed with that syringe, and I knew I had to send it. I put it in an email and hit send before I could change my mind. Mom's response came less than an hour after I sent the boundary letter. My phone buzzed with a text notification, and I made the mistake of opening it right away. The message filled my entire screen with block after block of text about how I was abandoning her in the worst grief of her life and destroying her last chance at happiness. She said I was being cruel and selfish after everything she'd sacrificed to raise me alone. She said Robert would be ashamed of how heartless I'd become. Then came the real threat. Buried in the middle of all that guilt, she was cutting off my phone plan at the end of the month, and she wouldn't be helping with any more college expenses if I didn't come home and talk to her like a reasonable adult. I stared at those words feeling sick. My phone service and part of my tuition came from Mom. I'd gotten some financial aid, but not enough to cover everything. I'd been counting on her help to get through this semester, at least. Now, she was using money as a weapon to force me back into her control. I showed Tristan the texts, and he could see the panic on my face. He reminded me that I could get my own phone plan for like $40 a month, and that financial aid offices dealt with situations like this all the time. But hearing that didn't stop the fear that was crawling up my throat. The idea of being completely financially independent at 18 felt huge and scary. I'd never had a real job before. I didn't know how I was going to pay for everything I needed. That night, I pulled up my resume on Tristan's laptop and started updating it with my limited work experience. I'd done some babysitting and volunteered at the library, but I didn't have much to put down. I spent hours searching for part-time jobs near campus that would work around my class schedule. Most places wanted someone who could work mornings and afternoons, but I had classes then. I finally found some evening positions at restaurants and retail stores and started filling out applications. My grades were probably, I'm going to suffer if I had to work 20 hours a week, but I needed to reduce how much power Mom had over me through money. Every application I submitted felt like another step toward real independence, even though it scared me. 3 days later, I was walking between classes when I saw Mom standing in the student center. My stomach twisted. She shouldn't be here. This was my space. Away from her. She spotted me and started walking toward me, calling my name. Other students turned to look. She got louder, talking about how I was breaking her heart and refusing to even have a conversation with my own mother. People were staring at us. I felt my face get hot with embarrassment. Mom's voice carried across the whole room as she said she just wanted to talk about Robert's memory and why I was being so cruel. I wanted to disappear. Instead, I turned around and walked away without saying anything back to her. She followed me for a few steps, still talking, but I kept walking until I got outside, and she finally stopped. My hands shook as I texted Tristan about what just happened. He said I did the right thing by not engaging, but I felt awful. That night, the reality of everything hit me all at once. I was in Tristan's bathroom, and suddenly I couldn't breathe right. My chest felt tight and my heart was racing and I couldn't get enough air no matter how hard I tried. My hands were shaking and I felt dizzy. I thought something was seriously wrong with me. I managed to text Naomi even though my fingers barely Worked. She called me right away and talked me through breathing exercises. She told me to focus on breathing in for 4 counts and out for 4 counts. She had me name 5 things I could see and 4 things I could touch. Slowly, my breathing started to even out. She said, what I just experienced was a panic attack, and that it was a normal response to the stress I was under. She said, feeling guilty about setting boundaries with mom was normal too, but it didn't mean I was doing the wrong thing. The next morning, I looked up legal aid services at the college. They had free consultations for students dealing with family law issues. I got an appointment with an attorney named Jeff McCoy for later that week. When I met with him, I told him everything from the beginning. The preserved sperm plan, the cycle, tracking, the pressure from family, the pressure, syringe incident, all of it. Jeff listened carefully and took notes. He said the situation was complicated, but the syringe incident was serious. He said it could potentially qualify for a proper protective order if I was willing to file a police report. The idea of reporting my own mother to the police made me want to throw up. Jeff explained that having documentation would create a paper trail if mom's behavior got worse. He walked me through the difference between a temporary restraining order that lasted a few weeks and a longer-term protective order that could last a year or more. He said I didn't have to decide right away, but I should think about whether I felt safe. I spent the next 3 days going back and forth in my head about whether to file the report. Part of me felt like I was overreacting and being dramatic. Mom was grieving and maybe I was making too big a deal out of one weird incident. But then I'd remember waking up to find her standing over my bed with that needle and the fear would come rushing back. I'd remember her researching ways to legally force me to give her genetic material. I'd remember all the boundary violations and the manipulation. Finally, I decided that my safety had to come first, even if it meant doing something that felt like betrayal. Going to the police, the station was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. My legs felt weak walking through the doors. I asked to speak to someone about filing a report and they sent me to talk to Officer Devin Lee. He was professional and kind as I explained and what had happened. I showed him photos I'd taken of the syringe I'd grabbed that night. He took my full statement and asked detailed questions about the incident and mom's other behavior. He photographed the syringe as evidence. The whole time I felt like I was doing something terrible to my own family. But I got through it. Officer Lee said they'd conduct a welfare check on mom and follow up with me. I left the station feeling shaky and weird. The police did their welfare check the next. Within an hour of them leaving my house, mom was calling my phone. I didn't answer, but she left voicemail after voicemail. Her voice got louder and more angry with each message. She screamed about how I'd humiliated her and destroyed her reputation by sending police to her door like she was some kind of criminal. She said Robert would be ashamed of what I'd become. She said I was killing his legacy and spitting on his memory. The messages got worse as they went on, with her voice breaking as she cried about how I'd ruined everything and taken away her last chance at having Robert's child. I saved all the voicemails before deleting them from my phone because I couldn't stand hearing her voice anymore. The next morning, my aunt called, and I almost didn't answer, but Naomi had told me to document everything. So I hit record on my phone before picking up. My aunt didn't even say hello before she started in on me about how I'd humiliated mom by sending police to the house like she was some kind of criminal. She said the whole family was talking about what a selfish brat I was being, and that I needed to stop this nonsense and come home. I tried to explain about the syringe, but she cut me off and said, Mom was just trying to help me understand my cycle better. She called me cruel for involving authorities in family business, and said I was breaking mom's heart during the hardest time of her life. When I said I didn't feel safe at home, my aunt laughed and told me I was being dramatic. The call lasted 5 minutes into sim. I barely said 10 words while she lectured me about family loyalty and gratitude. After I hung up, I sat on Tristan's couch shaking, and replayed the recording. Listening to it the second time, I could hear all the manipulation tactics Naomi had taught me to recognize. The guilt trips about family, the dismissal of my safety concerns, the way she made everything about Mom's feelings, and never once asked about mine. I sent the recording to Naomi and she confirmed what I was hearing. My whole family had been using these same tactics my entire life and I'd never noticed before. 2 days later, Tristan's landlord knocked on the door looking annoyed. He said Mom had been there twice asking if I was staying there and he didn't appreciate being pulled into tenant drama. He told Tristan that having an extra person living there violated the lease and I needed to find somewhere else to stay. Tristan tried to argue, but the landlord was firm. I had 1 week to move out. I spent every free moment between classes searching for affordable housing, and it felt impossible. Most places wanted first month last month, and a security deposit that I didn't have. Student housing was full, and the cheap apartments near campus had waiting lists. I finally found a post on the college housing board from 3 students looking for a 4th roommate to split rent on a gator house. The room was tiny and the rent was still a stretch, but it was the only option I could find. I met them that weekend, and they seemed nice enough even though the house was messy and loud. I signed the sublease agreement and moved my stuff in the next day. The new house was chaos from day one. One roommate played video games until 3:00 inches the morning with the volume up. Another had people over constantly and they'd smoke on the back porch right outside my window. The third roommate was never home and left rotting food in the tour fridge. Nobody cleaned the bathroom and the kitchen was always covered in dirty dishes. I felt on edge all the time because the front door didn't lock properly and people were always coming and going. I went to the hardware store and bought a deadbolt for my bedroom door and installed it myself using a video tutorial on my phone. I bought a metal lockbox from the thrift store and started keeping all my important flags documents in it under my bed. My birth certificate, social security card, bank statements, and all the documentation I'd been collecting about Mom went into that box. Every night before bed, I'd check that my door was locked and the box was still there. It wasn't home, and I didn't feel entirely safe, but it was better than going back to Mom's house, where she might show up with another syringe. Sleep became nearly impossible in the new place. I'd lie awake, listening to every sound and wondering if Mom had somehow found my address. When I did fall asleep, I had nightmares about waking up in a hospital bed, pregnant, or finding Mom standing over me. Again, I'd wake up gasping and covered in sweat multiple times a night. After the week of barely sleeping, I was exhausted all the time and could hardly focus in class. I told Naomi about it in our next session, and she taught me something called sleep hygiene. She said I needed to create a bedtime routine and make my room feel safer. We worked on grounding exercises I could do when I woke up scared. She had me name 5 things I could see, 4 things I could touch, 3 things I could hear. She taught me breathing patterns that would slow my heart rate down. It took weeks of practice, but slowly I started having nights where I'd sleep for 4 or 5 hours straight. It wasn't great, but it was better than the 2-hour stretches I'd have been getting. Jeff scheduled another meeting to talk about next steps for legal protection. We sat in his office, and he pulled out a thick packet of forms for a temporary restraining order. He walked me through each section and helped me write out detailed descriptions of everything that had happened. The cycle tracking Mom had done since I was 13. The pressure campaign with family members. The appointment she'd made at the fertility clinic claiming I'd agreed. The syringe incident with the exact date and time. The campus stalking. Every threatening voicemail with timestamps. Writing it all out in one document made me realize just how much Mom's behavior had gotten worse over the past few weeks. Each incident by itself had felt bad, but seeing them all listed together showed a clear pattern of her getting more desperate and more willing to cross boundaries. Jeff said the petition was strong and we had good evidence. But I wanted to be honest that getting a limited restraining order against a parent was difficult. Judges sometimes saw it as normal family conflict. Unless there was clear danger. The syringe incident was our strongest piece of evidence because it showed she was willing to physically intervene with my body without consent. The day after we filed the petition, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A woman introduced herself as Kay Booth from the legal department at the fertility clinic. She said Mom had called trying to schedule an appointment under my name and had sent them consent forms that were supposedly signed by me. Kay said the signatures didn't match what they had on file from when Mom had dragged me there before and the documents looked forged. She sounded genuinely horrified and said she was flagging my file immediately to prevent any unauthorized access or procedures. She asked if I wanted to file a formal complaint, and I said yes. Kay said she'd document everything and send me a written statement for my records. She also said the clinic was reviewing their security protocols because this should never have gotten as far as it did. I called Jeff right away and told him about the forged consent documents. He said this was exactly the kind of institutional documentation we needed, because it showed Mom was actively trying to force medical procedures on me through fraud. We added Kay's statement to the restraining order petition along with the clinic's internal report about the incident. Having professionals from the clinic confirm that Mom's behavior was serious and concerning made me feel less crazy. I'd spent so much time wondering if I was overreacting or being too sensitive. But now there was official documentation from multiple sources saying this wasn't normal family conflict. The clinic took it seriously enough to flag my file and change their procedures. The police took it seriously enough to do a welfare check and take my report. These weren't just my feelings anymore. There was proof that what Mom was doing was wrong. In my next therapy session, Naomi helped me work through some of the guilt I still felt about all as of this. She explained something called parentification, where a parent treats their child as a tool for meeting their own emotional needs instead of seeing them as a separate person with their own rights. She said, Mom's grief had turned me into an object in her healing process rather than a daughter who deserved protection and autonomy. Naomi said it was normal for me to feel guilty about setting boundaries because I'd been trained my whole life to prioritize Mom's feelings over my own safety. We talked about how love shouldn't require me to give up control of my own body and how real family relationships had to include respect for boundaries. Understanding these concepts helped, but didn't make the guilt go away completely. I still missed my mom. Sometimes, even though I knew going back, it wasn't safe. I missed the mom I'd had before Robert died, before grief twisted her into someone who could stand over my bed with a needle. The court date arrived faster than I expected, and I felt sick the entire morning. Jeff met me at the courthouse and walked me through what would happen. He said Mom would be there with her attorney, and they'd both have a chance to present their side. The judge would ask questions and then decide whether to grant the temporary restraining order. Jeff reminded me to stay calm and stick to the facts no matter what Mom or her lawyer said. We sat on a bench in the hallway waiting for our case to be called, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I kept thinking about having to see Mom face to face and explain to a judge why I needed legal protection from my own mother. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the Spotify description or comments. Every time the courtroom door opened, I jumped. When they finally called our case, I thought I might throw up, but I stood up and followed Jeff inside. Mom was already sitting at the other table with a man in a suit who I assumed was her attorney. She looked smaller than I remembered, and her eyes were red like she'd been crying. For a second, I felt terrible for putting her through this. But then I remembered waking up to find her standing over me with that syringe, and the fear came rushing back. Her attorney stood up first and started talking about how I was an unstable teenager going through a rebellious phase and exaggerating normal family conflict. He called the syringe incident a misunderstanding and said Mom had only been trying to help me track my cycle for health reasons. He made it sound like I was being dramatic and ungrateful after everything Mom had sacrificed to raise me alone. Hearing him twist everything made my blood boil, but Jeff had warned me this would happen. He touched my arm and shook his head slightly, reminding me to stay calm and let him handle it. Jeff stood up and started laying out the evidence we'd collected. He showed the judge copies of the cycle tracking calendars Mom had been keeping since I was 13, and I watched the judge's face change as he flipped through pages and pages of dates and notes about my body that I never knew existed. Jeff presented the clinic statement about Mom trying to schedule appointments using my name and the forged consent documents. Then he showed the police report from the prostate syringe incident with photos of the needle I'd managed to grab before locking myself in the bathroom. When it was my turn to testify, I felt like I might throw up. But I stood up and walked to the witness stand. The judge asked me to describe what happened in my own words, and I started with Mom cornering me in the kitchen on my 18th birthday with the folder full of fertility documents. My voice shook when I explained how she'd been planning this since I got my first period, how she'd tracked my cycles for years without telling me, how she'd made appointments at clinics and told them I'd agreed when I absolutely hadn't. I described waking up to find her standing over my bed with a syringe and the terror of not knowing what was in it or what she planned to do. The judge listened carefully and asked specific questions about the timeline and whether I'd ever given any indication I might be willing to participate in this plan. I told him no, that I'd said no from the very first conversation, and every single time after. To that, Mom's attorney tried to interrupt, but the judge held up his hand and let me finish. After I sat back down, Jeff called Tristan to provide a witness statement. Tristan explained how I'd shown up at his apartment that morning, terrified and shaking, how Mom had come to his building multiple times looking for me, how his landlord had gotten upset about the disruptions. He described the state I'd been in when I first arrived, and how I'd been afraid to go back home. Having someone else confirm what I'd been through felt important because it wasn't just my word against Mom's anymore. When Tristan finished, the judge took a few minutes to review all the documents and photos we'd submitted. Then he looked at Mom and asked if she understood that what she'd been doing constituted coercion, and that her daughter had the right to refuse any medical procedure. Mom started crying and said she just wanted to honor Robert's memory, and that I was too young to understand what I was giving up. The judge's expression didn't change. He granted a temporary restraining order that prohibited Mom from contacting me about anything related to reproduction, surrogacy, pregnancy, or fertility, and she couldn't come within 100 yards of my residence, campus, or workplace. The order also stated she couldn't make any medical decisions on my behalf, and couldn't access any of my medical records. It wasn't everything I'd hoped for, but it was real legal protection on paper that I could enforce. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt exhausted and relieved and sad all at the same time. Over the next few days, I started noticing posts on social media from Mom's grief support group. The posts were vague but clearly about me, talking about ungrateful children who abandon their parents in their darkest hour, and how painful it is when family turns their back on you. Several of my extended family members shared these posts and added their own comments about how young people today don't understand sacrifice or family loyalty. I recognized it was a public shaming campaign designed to make me feel guilty and pressure me to back down. My aunt posted something about how some daughters forget everything their mothers did for them, and my cousin commented with a crying emoji and said, "It was heartbreaking when kids are so selfish." I sat on my bed in the sublet room staring at my phone and feeling sick. I went through all my social media accounts and made them private. Then I started blocking family members who were participating in Mom's narrative. It Hurt to cut off people I'd known my whole life. My aunt who used to take me shopping for school clothes. My grandma, who taught me to bake cookies. Cousins I'd grown up with at family gatherings. But I couldn't handle the constant judgment and pressure while I was trying to heal. Each time I hit the block button, I felt guilty and relieved for the same time. A week later, I had an empathy appointment with the financial aid office at the school to discuss my line dependency status. I brought copies of the restraining order and the police report and a letter from Naomi explaining the family estrangement. The financial aid counselor reviewed everything carefully and said they could reconsider my status as an independent student based on the documented evidence of abuse and the legal separation. The process would take several weeks and I'd need to provide additional documentation, but eventually they approved me for additional aid that covered most of my tuition and some living expenses. The relief I felt when I got the approval email was huge, because it meant I wasn't completely trapped by financial dependence on mom anymore. I started looking for part-time work that would fit around my class schedule and found a position at a campus coffee shop. The pay was minimum wage and the hours weren't great, but having my own income made me feel more secure and independent. My first shift was overwhelming because I had to learn the register and memorize drink recipes while dealing with the constant rush of students, but the other workers were patient and helped me figure things out. Every paycheck felt like proof that I could actually support myself, even if it was just barely. 2 weeks after the nadir restraining order was granted, I came home to my sublet and found a package on the doorstep. There was no return address, but I recognized mom's handwriting. Inside were baby photos of me with Robert, pictures I'd never seen before of him holding me when I was tiny, pushing me on swings, helping me blow out birthday candles. There was a note tucked between the photos that said, Robert had loved me so much and would want me to help keep his memory alive. My hands shook as I took photos of everything with my phone to document the violation. I called the non-emergency police line and explained that my mother had violated the restraining order by leaving items at my residence. The officer who came to take my report was different from Officer Lee, but he knew about my case and took it seriously. He collected the package as evidence and said they'd issue mom a formal warning that any further violations would result in arrest. The warning must have scared her because the direct contact stopped after that. But a few days later, my aunt called and left a voicemail saying mom was devastated and telling everyone I'd destroyed her life and taken away her last connection to Robert. My aunt said mom was the real victim here and that I was being cruel by refusing to help her heal. I didn't return the call, but hearing that mom was still building a narrative where she was the victim made me angry. She was telling people I'd abandoned her instead of acknowledging that she'd tried to force me into carrying a pregnancy against my will. I tried to focus on my own healing, like Naomi kept reminding me to do. But it was hard knowing that half my family believed mom's version of events. At work a few weeks later, I was taking orders during the afternoon rush when a pregnant woman came up to the register. She wasn't even that far along, but seeing her hand resting on her belly made everything come rushing back. Reparents, cycle calendars, the fertility clinic, mom standing over my bed with that syringe. My chest got tight and I couldn't breathe properly, and my vision, I started tunneling. I heard myself apologize to the customer and then I was stumbling toward the back room. My manager found me sitting on the floor by the storage shelves, hyperventilating and crying. She helped me do breathing exercises and told me to take as long as I needed that she'd cover my register. After 20 minutes, I felt stable enough to go back out, but I was shaky for the rest of my shift. That night, I realized I was going to be dealing with triggers related to pregnancy and babies for a long time, that this wasn't something that would just go away because I had a restraining order and a therapist. In my next session with Naomi, we started working on actual strategies for dealing with pregnancy triggers instead of just talking about them. She had me practice breathing exercises and grounding techniques that I could use when I saw pregnant women or babies in public. We went through scenarios where I'd imagine seeing someone with a baby bump, and I'd practice noticing the panic starting, and then using the tools to calm myself down before it got worse. The hardest part was when Naomi asked me to think about whether I might want kids someday on my own terms, separate from what Mom had tried to force on me. I couldn't even go there mentally without feeling sick. She explained that Mom's coercion had tangled up my own future choices with trauma, and untangling that would take time. We made a plan to just focus on managing the immediate triggers for now, and save the bigger questions about my own reproductive choices for later, when I felt more stable. I left that session with a list of coping strategies written on an index card that I kept in my pocket at work. A week later, I went to my first support group meeting for young adults dealing with family estrangement. The meeting was in a community center basement, and there were about 12 people sitting in a circle. I felt nervous walking in because I didn't know if my situation would sound as serious as other people's problems. But the facilitator was welcoming and said I could just listen if I wasn't ready to share. The first person who spoke was a guy around my age whose parents had kicked him out for being gay. Then a woman in her 20s talked about cutting off her dad after years of verbal abuse. Someone else shared about their mom's addiction issues and having to go no contact for their own safety. When it was my turn, I gave a brief version of what happened with Mom and the preserved sperm and the syringe incident. Nobody looked shocked or judgmental. A few people nodded like they understood completely. After the meeting, 3 different people came up to me and said they'd also dealt with parents who couldn't respect boundaries around their bodies or medical decisions. One woman said her mom had tried to force her into weight loss surgery. Another person's dad had refused to accept their decision not to have kids. Hearing that other people had to set hard boundaries with family members over bodily autonomy made me feel so much less alone, and less like I was being dramatic or cruel. 3 months after the initial restraining order, Jeff called to remind me about the hearing to extend it for a full year. I'd been so focused on work and school and therapy that I'd almost let myself forget it was coming up. The temporary order had been working, and Mom had mostly stayed away except for that one package violation. So part of me hoped the judge would just automatically extend it. But Jeff explained that Mom's attorney would argue against the extension, and I should be prepared to see her again and possibly testify. I felt less terrified than the first hearing because I knew what to expect now. But I still spent the night before barely sleeping, dreading having to be in the same room as Mom. I picked out clothes that made me look older and more credible, and I practiced what I might say if the judge asked me questions. Jeff met me outside the courthouse that morning and went over the plan one more time. Inside the courtroom, Mom was already sitting at the other table with her attorney. She looked smaller somehow, and older. Her hair was different, and she'd lost weight. When she saw me walk in, she started crying quietly, and her attorney handed her tissues. I forced myself to look away and focus on Jeff. Instead, the judge came in and called the case, and Mom's attorney stood up first. She argued that Mom had been in therapy consistently for the past 3 months and had come to understand that she'd made mistakes in how she approached me about having Robert's baby. She said Mom was grieving and not thinking clearly, but that she'd done the work to process her grief in healthier ways. The attorney said a full restraining order was excessive, given that Mom had only violated once, and it was just leaving a package, not anything threatening. She asked the judge to either let the order expire or reduce it to a shorter time frame with less strict conditions. Listening to her make Mom sound like the victim who just needed understanding made my chest tight with anger. Then Jeff stood up and presented his evidence. He had printouts of the social media posts from Mom's grief support group where she'd been talking about me and building a short narrative about being abandoned. He showed the judge documentation of the way restraining order violation with the package of photos, and the guilt-tripping note. He explained that this showed a pattern of ongoing harassment, even with the order in place, and that Mom was still trying to manipulate me, through indirect means and by recruiting other people to her cause. Jeff argued that Mom hadn't actually acknowledged the specific harm she'd caused or shown real understanding of why her behavior was wrong, just that she'd learned to hide it better. He said I needed the full year to heal and establish my independence without constant pressure. The judge looked through all the evidence carefully and asked Jeff a few clarifying questions about the social place, media posts, and whether Mom had tried to contact me through other family members. Then the judge asked me if I wanted to make a statement. I stood up, and my legs felt shaky, but I managed to speak clearly. I said I was still dealing with anxiety every day and having trouble sleeping, and that I had panic attacks when I saw pregnant women because of what Mom had tried to force me into. I explained that I needed space to heal without the constant pressure and manipulation, and that even though Mom claimed to understand, the social media post showed she was still trying to control the narrative and make herself the victim. I said I just wanted to feel safe and have control over my own body and my own future. The judge nodded and then looked directly at Mom and asked her if she understood why her behavior had been harmful to me. Mom stood up and started talking in this quiet, wounded voice. She said she never meant to hurt me, and she was just trying to honor Robert's memory because the grief was so overwhelming. She talked about how much she missed him and how empty her life felt without him, and how having his baby would have given her something to live for. She said she couldn't understand why I wouldn't help her when she'd given up so much to raise me as a single mother after my dad left. She cried and said she just wanted me to know how much pain she was in. The whole statement was about her grief and her pain, not about what she'd done to me. She never actually acknowledged the cycle tracking, or the syringe incident, or the coercion. She just kept saying she wanted to honor Robert and couldn't understand why I was being so cruel. Listening to her completely missed the point made me realize she still didn't get it at all, and probably never would. The judge looked frustrated and said that while he sympathized with Mom's grief, the evidence showed she hadn't truly grasped the severity of her actions or the harm they caused. He extended the protective order for 1 full year with all the same restrictions about not coming near me or contacting me about reproductive matters. Then he added a new provision that any contact between us had to be initiated by me, not by her, or through other people. He said if Mom violated the order again, she would face criminal charges. Walking out of the courthouse after the hearing, I felt this weird mix of relief and sadness. I was glad to have another year of legal protection, but it hurt that it had come to this, that my own mother couldn't respect my body's basic right to control my own body. 2 weeks later, I signed a lease on a tiny studio apartment that cost more than I could really afford. The place was maybe 300 feet with a bathroom so small I could barely turn around, but it had its own entrance and its own locks that only I had keys to. Moving in with just my clothes, a used mattress, and some basic kitchen stuff from the thrift store felt both exciting and lonely. I spent my first night there sitting on the floor, eating cereal for dinner and feeling proud that I'd created this safe space for myself, even though it meant living on almost nothing. I installed a chain lock on the door and checked it 3 times before going to bed. Having my own place with my own locks felt worth every bit of the financial strain. A few days after I moved in, I got an email from Grandma. The subject line just said, "Thinking of you." And when I opened it, the message was carefully worded and gentle. She said she'd been thinking about everything that happened and wanted to understand my perspective better and asked if we could talk sometime when I was ready. She didn't pressure me or take sides, just said she loved me and wanted to hear my side of things. I stared at that email for a long time, feeling tempted to respond right away because I missed her. But I remembered how she'd initially told me I should consider carrying the baby for Mom, and I knew that talking to her could become another way for Mom to try to reach me or pressure me through. I decided to wait until I felt more stable and secure in my boundaries. Before opening that door, I saved the email in a folder but didn't respond. The semester ended a week later, and when I checked my final grades, they were lower than I'd ever gotten before. I'd managed to pass everything, but my GPA had dropped significantly. A few of my professors had been understanding. When I explained I was dealing with a family crisis, and one had even extended a deadline for me when I was struggling, right after the first court hearing, I felt grateful that I hadn't had to drop out completely despite everything that had happened. Sitting in my studio, looking at my grades, I realized I'd survived something that could have destroyed my whole life. And even though my academic performance had suffered, I was still here and still moving forward. I registered for spring classes a week later with a plan to take only 12 credits instead of the usual 15. The academic advisor asked if I was sure about the lighter load, and I told her I needed more time for work and personal stuff. She didn't push for details. I picked classes that met on Tuesdays and Thursdays so I could work longer shifts at the coffee shop on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. My schedule felt more manageable than last semester, when I'd been trying to handle a full course load while everything with mom was falling apart. Walking across campus to my first class of the semester, I noticed other students looking excited and energized while I just felt tired. They were probably taking full loads and doing internships and joining clubs. I was taking the minimum credits and working to pay rent on a tiny studio. Part of me felt like I was falling behind everyone else my age, but I reminded myself that I was dealing with stuff most of them couldn't imagine. 3 weeks into the semester, I got a call from the fertility clinic while I was restocking cups at work. Kay from the legal department said she was calling to inform me that the preserved samples in my mother's account were being disposed of due to 6 months of non-payment on storage fees. She wanted to make sure I knew this was happening in case I had any concerns. I told her I didn't have any concerns at all, and thanked her for letting me know. After I hung up, I felt this weird sense of relief that the physical evidence of mom's plan was finally being destroyed. That night, I checked mom's grief support group page out of curiosity and found a long post about how cruel storage facilities were for charging fees during times of grief. She wrote about how her ungrateful daughter had forced her into financial hardship by requiring legal proceedings, making it impossible to maintain precious stored materials that represented her last connection to her deceased husband. Several group members commented with sympathy and anger at the system. One woman wrote that children today had no respect for their parents' sacrifices. Reading it should have made me feel guilty, but instead I just felt too annoyed. The samples were never my responsibility, and mom's financial problems weren't my fault. My next therapy session with Naomi focused on the complicated feelings I had about the whole situation. I told her I didn't really miss Robert himself since I'd only known him for 3 years when I was little. What I missed was the idea of having a mom who saw me as a person instead of a tool for her grief. Naomi asked me to describe the kind of relationship I wished I could have with mom. I talked about wanting a mom who asked about my classes and my friends, who was proud of me for surviving everything I'd been through, who respected my choices, even when she didn't agree with them. Saying it out loud made me realize how far away that relationship was from reality. Naomi said that accepting mom might never be capable of being that person was painful, but also necessary for my own healing. She explained that I was grieving a relationship that never existed and might never exist, which was different from grieving a person who died. I left that session feeling sad, but also somehow lighter, like I'd been given permission to stop hoping mom would suddenly become someone different. A few weeks later, Tristan texted asking if I wanted to grab dinner with him and some friends. When I got to the Seth restaurant, he introduced me to his girlfriend, Maya, who was funny and easy to talk to. She asked about my classes and what I was studying without any awkwardness about my situation. The other people there were friends from Tristan's gaming group, and they included me in their conversations about normal stuff like upcoming movies and terrible professors. Sitting there, eating pizza and laughing at someone's story about their roommate, I realized how isolated I'd been. I'd been so focused on survival and therapy and legal stuff that I'd forgotten what it felt like to just hang out with people my age doing regular things. Tristan caught my eye across the table and smiled, and I felt grateful that he'd stuck around through everything. On the look, I walked back to my studio. I thought about how important it was to have examples of healthy relationships after spending so long in Mom's twisted version of love. 6 months after the judge first granted the restraining order, I got a letter from Mom's attorney in my campus mailbox. My hands shook opening it because I expected more legal threats or demands. Instead, it was a short personal letter from Mom saying she was sorry for the pain she'd caused. She wrote that she'd been thinking a lot about everything that happened and she hoped someday I would understand she'd been trying to create something beautiful from loss. She said she missed me and wanted me to know she still loved me even though we couldn't be in contact right now. The letter didn't ask for anything or try to manipulate me into responding. It just expressed regret and hope for future reconciliation. I read it 3 times, sitting on my bed, and by the 3rd time, I was crying, not because I was ready to forgive her or let her back into my life, but because the letter showed she still didn't get it. She was still framing everything around her intentions and her grief. She still saw forcing me to carry Robert's baby as something beautiful instead of recognizing it as violation. I brought the letter to my meeting with Jeff the next week and asked him to help me write a response. He read it carefully and said I wasn't obligated to respond at all, but if I wanted to, we should make sure it was clear and firm. We spent an hour drafting a reply that acknowledged her apology, but restated my boundaries. I wrote that I understood she'd been acting from grief, but her intentions didn't change the harm she'd caused. I said I needed her to respect my autonomy and stop contacting me about reconciliation until I was ready to initiate that conversation myself. Jeff helped me keep the tone calm and factual, instead of angry or emotional. Sending that letter felt like drawing a line in the sand. I wasn't slamming the door forever, but I was making it clear that any future relationship would be on my terms. 2 weeks later, I got an email saying I'd been accepted into a summer research program through the biology department. The program came with a small stipend that would cover most of my rent for 3 months. Plus, it would look good on my resume. I'd applied on a whim back in February, not really expecting to get in since my grades had dropped. Reading the acceptance email in the Ray campus library, I felt this rush of relief about the money, but also something bigger. The program meant I had something to look forward to, something that was about building my future instead of just surviving my present. I called Naomi from outside the library to tell her the news, and she said she was proud of me for applying, even when things were hard. That night, I celebrated by buying myself a fancy coffee drink I normally couldn't afford, and sitting in my studio feeling like maybe things were actually getting it's better. My 19th birthday fell on a Thursday in late March. I didn't tell anyone it was my birthday because I didn't want a big deal made out of it. When I got home from class, there was a card in my mailbox from Grandma. Inside was a short note saying she respected my 2S choices and would be here whenever I was ready to reconnect. She'd included a $20 bill and a PS that said she was proud of me for taking care of myself. It was the first communication from family that didn't come with pressure or judgment attached. I put the card on my tiny kitchen counter and looked at it while I ate cereal for dinner. Having that one small connection to family that felt safe made me think that maybe someday some of these relationships could heal. Not with Mom. Probably not for a long time. But maybe with Grandma and possibly others who could respect my free boundaries. At my next therapy session, Naomi suggested we create a framework for what would need to happen before I'd consider allowing limited contact with Mom. We made a list together. First, Mom would need to be in consistent therapy for at least a year with a trauma specialist. Second, she'd need to demonstrate genuine accountability by acknowledging specific harm she caused without making excuses. Third, she'd need to show she could respect boundaries by not violating the restraining order and not using other people to contact me. Fourth, any contact would need to be supervised by a mediator at first. Looking at the list, I knew I wasn't ready for any of this yet and might not be for years. But having a framework helped me feel less guilty about maintaining distance. It wasn't about punishing Mom forever. It was about protecting myself until she could prove she'd changed. The following week, I set up a new email address, specifically for family contact. I gave the address to Jeff to share with Mom's attorney with clear instructions that it was only for important family information like deaths or medical emergencies. I told Naomi about the email and we agreed I'd only check it once a week during our therapy sessions, so I'd have support if there was anything upsetting. This felt like a middle ground between completely cutting off all contact forever and being vulnerable to surprise messages that could ambush me emotionally. Having that controlled channel gave me back some power over when and how I engaged with family instead of constantly worrying about what might show up in my regular inbox or mailbox. Naomi said this was the good example of creating boundaries that protected me while leaving space for possible future healing. 9 months after leaving home, I woke up on a Tuesday morning and realized I'd slept through the entire night without a single. I lay there for a minute, staring at my ceiling, waiting for the usual panic to hit, but it didn't come. My body felt different, like the constant tension I'd been carrying had loosened just enough that I could breathe all the way down into my lungs. I got up and made coffee in my tiny kitchen, and the routine felt normal, instead of like survival. My studio, the apartment was small, and the furniture was all secondhand, but it was mine. I'd picked out the blue curtains and hung the cheap posters on the walls, and nobody could come in without my permission. Looking around at my space, while I drank my coffee, I felt something close to pride. My life wasn't perfect, and the situation with Mom wasn't resolved and probably wouldn't be for years. But I'd built something stable and safe for myself when I didn't think I could. I'd made it 9 months on my own, working and going to the school, and handling therapy appointments, and paying rent. Some days were still really hard. Yesterday, I'd seen a pregnant float woman at the coffee shop and had to go sit in the back room for 10 minutes to calm down. I still checked the locks on my door 3 times before bed and sometimes woke up thinking I heard Mom's voice. I missed having a mother, or at least I missed the idea of what a mother should be. But I was learning that healing didn't mean everything got fixed, or that relationships magically repaired themselves. It meant I'd created a life where I had control over my own body and my own future. It meant I could say no and make choices and nobody could force me into something I didn't want. The mornings I still felt guilty for choosing myself over Mom's grief. But then I remembered her standing over my bed with that syringe and I knew I'd done the right thing. I got ready for my shift at the coffee shop and headed out, locking my door behind me. I had class later and then therapy with Naomi. My schedule was full and my bank account was usually close to empty and I was tired a lot. But I was proud of myself for getting out even when it was scary. I knew I could handle whatever came next, because I'd already survived the worst thing I could imagine. Walking to work in the morning sun, I felt ready for the day ahead. And that's the end of this 1. I like when stories remind us of something useful, even if it's simple. If it made you pause or think a little differently, that's a win. Subscribe so you can catch the next one when it drops.